The first punch landed with a satisfying thud against the heavy bag, sending a jolt through Sarah's arm. The second hit harder, and the third even harder still. Each impact carried away fragments of her pain, transforming grief into something more productive. Her kickboxing instructor, Jin, nodded approvingly from across the gym. "Channel that anger," he called out. "But control it. Don't let it control you." Sarah had discovered urban boxing 3 weeks after leaving Marcus, when sleep became an elusive luxury and her thoughts refused to quiet. The gym, with its raw concrete walls and perpetual scent of determination, couldn't have been more different from the couple's yoga studio Marcus had insisted they join. Here there was no pretense, no need to maintain a perfect image, just honest sweat and the therapeutic rhythm of fists against leather. Between rounds, her phone buzzed with Marcus's latest message. "I've started therapy. I'm learning why I did what I did. Please give me a chance to explain." Sarah deleted it without reading further, her wrapped hands steady as they ever were. The messages didn't stop coming, but their power over her diminished with each passing day. Back in her new studio apartment, transformation took a different form. The walls, once a sterile white, now blazed with the deep red she'd always loved, but Marcus had deemed too aggressive for their shared space. Her photography equipment, relegated to storage during their relationship, claimed pride of place near the window. The light there was perfect for portraits, though these days she preferred capturing the raw energy of city streets. "You're getting good at this," remarked Victor, the gruff street photographer who'd become an unexpected mentor after she'd asked to photograph him working in the park. "You've got an eye for honest moments." Sarah studied the contact sheets from her latest session, faces caught in unguarded instances of joy, contemplation, and determination. She recognized something of herself in each image, the businessman's furrowed brow matching her own confusion, a child's unbridled laughter reflecting her rediscovered freedom, an elderly couple's tender exchange representing what real love should look like. Her sister Lisa visited often, bringing takeout and concerned glances. "You're different," she observed one evening, watching Sarah edit photos while Mochi purred contentedly in her lap. "Stronger." "I'm just becoming who I always was," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. The pain hadn't disappeared. It still ambushed her in quiet moments, still colored her dreams, but it had transformed into something useful, like coal under pressure becoming diamond. Her phone lit up again. "Marcus, I miss our Sunday brunches. Remember how we used to plan our whole week over coffee and crosswords?" Sarah glanced at her calendar, already filled with photography assignments, kickboxing classes, and coffee dates with new friends who knew her only as she was now, not as half of a broken whole. She didn't need to plan her week around anyone else's schedule anymore. For the first time in years, her time was truly her own, and she was learning to fill it with purpose rather than permission. The morning started with a small victory. Sarah had gone a full 24 hours without checking Marcus's social media. She celebrated by treating herself to coffee at Cafe Una, deliberately choosing the location across town from their all-favorite spot. The universe, it seemed, had other plans. She was examining the pastry display when a familiar cologne hit her senses, followed by the sound of papers scattering across the floor. Sarah turned to find Marcus kneeling to gather dropped documents, his once immaculate appearance notably disheveled. His designer suit had been replaced by wrinkled khakis and an untucked button-down. Gray streaked his temples. Had that been there before? "Sarah," he breathed her name like a prayer, frozen in his crouch. A self-help book lay among his scattered papers, its title glaring, Healing from Infidelity, Rebuilding Trust After Betrayal. The barista called out her order, oat milk latte for Sarah, breaking the spell. Marcus scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over a nearby chair. 5 months ago, she would have steadied it for him. Now, she watched him fumble, feeling oddly detached. "You look," he started, then stopped, seeming to realize there was no safe way to end that sentence. She did look different, stronger certainly. The kickboxing had toned her arms, and her new photography career had given her a confidence he'd never seen before. "You look tired," she offered, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. It wasn't kindness exactly, but the sort of compassion one might feel for a stranger's struggle. I haven't been sleeping well, he admitted, clutching his papers to his chest like a shield. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of therapy. Sarah nodded, taking a sip of her latte. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Did you know, he finally continued, his voice cracking, that I watched my father cycle through 3 affairs before I was 12. Dr. Martinez, my therapist, she says I've been recreating his patterns, sabotaging good things because I never learned. He trailed off, looking lost. That's really good, Marcus, Sarah said, meaning it. Understanding why you hurt people is important. I miss you, he blurted out. The apartment feels wrong without your photos everywhere. Without Mochi attacking my shoelaces in the morning. Without your laugh. I'm doing the work, Sarah, real work. Not just therapy, but everything. I quit my job. Sarah's eyebrows rose involuntarily. You what? Couldn't stay there. Not with, well, I'm at a smaller firm now. Less money, but better hours, more integrity. He smiled weakly. I volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends. Something squeezed in Sarah's chest. Not love, but recognition. The man before her was both familiar and strange, like a photograph slightly out of focus. She could see traces of the person she'd loved, glimpses of someone new emerging from the wreckage he'd created. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said softly, gathering her things. I really do. As she turned to leave, his voice followed her. I already found it, and I lost it, but I'm becoming someone worthy of finding it again. Sarah stepped into the morning sunlight, letting the door close behind her without looking back. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart wasn't racing, and that, perhaps, was the most significant change of all. The table was set with the kind of precision that spoke of barely controlled rage. Sarah adjusted the Venetian wine glasses one final time, the crystal stems catching the light from the dim chandelier. She'd chosen their wedding china, each pristine plate a mockery of the future they'd planned. The butternut squash soup, despite its earlier rebellion, now sat perfectly garnished with fresh cream and chives. In the center of the table, Marcus's iPad waited like a ticking bomb. Sarah heard his key in the lock at exactly 7:43 p.m., the same time as always, because if Marcus Hamilton was anything, he was a creature of habit. Even his affair, she'd noticed from the messages, followed a predictable pattern: Tuesday lunches, Thursday evening meetings, and the occasional weekend business trip. Something smells amazing. His voice carried from the entryway, followed by the familiar sound of his briefcase hitting the console table. Is that your famous butternut squash soup? Sarah touched her reflection in the window, checking her appearance one last time. She wore the midnight blue dress he'd given her for their last anniversary, her dark hair swept up in an elegant twist. Her makeup was flawless, though it had taken 3 attempts to apply her mascara with steady hands. Sarah. Marcus appeared in the dining room doorway, his tie slightly loosened, dark hair artfully tousled. He looked exactly the same as he had that morning when he'd kissed her goodbye. How was that possible? Shouldn't infidelity leave some visible mark? Welcome home, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I thought we deserved a special dinner. He crossed the room, planting a kiss on her cheek that felt like acid against her skin. What's the occasion? Sit. She gestured to his usual chair. I'll serve the soup. She watched him settle in, watched him admire the table setting, watched him take his first appreciative sip of wine. She waited until he lifted his spoon to the soup before reaching out and turning the iPad screen on with a deliberate tap. The messages from Amy lit up the screen like accusations. Marcus's spoon clattered against the bowl. Sarah, I can explain. Please do. Her voice remained eerily calm. Explain the dinner at La Maison last Thursday when you were supposedly at a client meeting. Explain the weekend in Chicago when I was visiting my parents. Explain why Amy from marketing knows that you cry during thunderstorms, while I spent 5 years thinking you were just a heavy sleeper. It's not, it wasn't. He reached for her hand across the table. It meant nothing. Sarah withdrew her hand slowly, deliberately. That's interesting, she said, pulling up another message thread. Because according to this message from 2 weeks ago, you told her she means everything to you. Which is it, Marcus? The soup grew cold between them as Marcus cycled through denial, anger, and finally, desperate pleading. Sarah sat through it all with the composure of a queen, though her hands trembled beneath the table. When he finally fell silent, tears streaming down his face, she stood up slowly. "I've packed your things," she said quietly. "They're in the guest room. I'll be staying at Lisa's tonight. When I come back tomorrow, I expect you to be gone." The morning after the confrontation, Sarah stood in her office bathroom, staring at her reflection while her phone buzzed incessantly in her purse. 37 missed calls from Marcus, 63 text messages, 5 voicemails she couldn't bring herself to hear. With trembling fingers, she typed out an email to her boss, requesting an emergency week of vacation. "Family crisis," she wrote, the words blurring through her tears. Her sister Lisa arrived within an hour of her call, armed with empty boxes and a steely determination that Sarah herself couldn't muster. Me, her best friend since college, showed up shortly after with coffee, bagels, and a rental agreement for a furnished studio apartment in her building. Just temporary, May assured her, though they both knew nothing would ever be temporary again. The apartment Sarah had shared with Marcus for 3 years became a battlefield of memories. Each room held landmines of betrayal, waiting to explode at the slightest touch. In the kitchen, she found a hidden receipt for a romantic dinner at La Maison, dated during her business trip to Chicago, the same restaurant where they'd celebrated their first anniversary. The same weekend he claimed to be working late on the Johnson account. "Sarah," Lisa called from the bedroom, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You need to see this." In Marcus's bedside drawer, beneath his collection of watches, lay a birthday card from Amy. The message inside spoke of secret moments and hidden desires, dated 3 months ago. Sarah remembered that day, how she'd surprised Marcus at his office with cupcakes, how he'd seemed distracted and almost annoyed by her presence. Now she knew why. The discoveries kept coming, each one a fresh wound. A dating app notification flashed across his iPad while she was canceling their shared Netflix account. A hotel key card from the Meridian fell from his suit jacket as she cleared the closet. A folder of photos on his laptop, hidden behind work documents, documented outings she'd never known about. "I'll kill him," Lisa muttered, watching Sarah's face crumple as she found a pair of women's earrings behind the dresser. Not hers. Definitely not Amy's, based on the photos she'd seen. "Don't," Sarah whispered, wrapping the earrings in a tissue and dropping them into the trash. "He's not worth it." By sunset, Sarah's life had been reduced to 12 boxes, 2 suitcases, and a cat carrier containing a very unhappy Mochi. As she stood in the doorway one last time, her key lying on the kitchen counter beside her engagement ring, her phone lit up with another message from Marcus. "Please come home. We can fix this. I'll do anything." Sarah picked up her cat carrier, squared her shoulders, and walked out without looking back. Behind her, Lisa and Mie exchanged glances as they gathered the last of the boxes. They knew their friend well enough to recognize this wasn't just an exit, it was an awakening. Sarah Chen had always believed that life-changing moments announce themselves with grand fanfare, thunderstorms, dramatic music, or at least a sense of foreboding. Instead, her world shattered on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening, between stirring a pot of butternut squash soup and checking a recipe for crusty bread. The iPad she'd borrowed from Marcus lay innocently on the granite countertop, a wedding gift they'd received from his parents 3 months before their planned ceremony. Sarah had just wiped her hands on her favorite apron, the one with tiny watercolor cats that Marcus had given her last Christmas, when the notifications began flooding the screen. Asterisk ding, ding, ding asterisk. 3 messages from Amy from marketing appeared in rapid succession. Sarah's finger hovered over the dismiss button, but something in the preview caught her eye. A heart emoji, then another. Her stomach clenched as she opened the message thread, telling herself she was being paranoid, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. There wasn't. "Last night was amazing." Amy's message read, "I can still taste the wine on your lips." Sarah's hands began to tremble as she scrolled up through the conversation history. 37 intimate conversations, 16 hidden dates, photos of candlelit dinners at restaurants she'd never visited, inside jokes she wasn't part of, plans for a weekend getaway to the same beach when Marcus had proposed. The worst part wasn't the evidence of physical betrayal, it was the emotional intimacy that radiated from every exchange. Marcus had shared his fears about his father's illness with Amy, something he'd barely discussed with Sarah. He'd sent Amy photos of the stray cat that visited their apartment balcony, calling it their little secret. He'd even shared the playlist he claimed he'd made specially for Sarah on their first anniversary. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers, its screen cracking against the hardwood floor in a spiderweb pattern that perfectly mirrored the fractures forming in her heart. The sound startled their cat, Mochi, who had been weaving between her legs, sensing her distress. Amy, from marketing. The same woman Marcus had laughed about at last month's office party. She's just being friendly, he'd assured Sarah, kissing her forehead when she'd noticed Amy's lingering touches on his arm. You know how some people are, they don't understand boundaries. The soup began to boil over, filling the kitchen with the smell of burning squash. Sarah moved mechanically to turn off the stove, her mind replaying every suspicious moment she'd dismissed over the past 3 months. The late nights at work, the sudden business trips, the new cologne, the password changes on his phone, the way he'd started sleeping with it face down. As the reality of her discovery settled into her bones, Sarah did something that surprised even herself. She reached for the fancy wine they'd been saving for their wedding, poured herself a generous glass, and began to plan. The animal shelter buzzed with weekend activity as Sarah pushed open the glass doors. She spotted Marcus immediately, kneeling beside a cage, speaking softly to a gray tabby cat that looked remarkably like Mochi. He wore jeans and a faded shelter volunteer t-shirt, so different from the power suits that once defined him. A small crowd of potential adopters surrounded him, drawn in by his gentle way with the animals. He looked up as she approached, hope and fear dancing across his features. The diamond ring box visible in his back pocket didn't surprise her. She'd known, somehow, that this would be his final play. The old Sarah might have found it romantic. The new Sarah found it desperate. "You came," he said, standing slowly. The tabby cat meowed in protest at the loss of attention. "I did." Sarah knelt to offer her hand to the cat, who sniffed it cautiously before headbutting her palm. "She's beautiful. Like Mochi," Marcus said softly. "Sarah, I..." "Don't," she interrupted, keeping her eyes on the cat. "Let me go first." She stood, finally meeting his gaze. His eyes were clear, present in a way they hadn't been during their relationship. The therapy had done its work. She could see the change in how he held himself, how he waited for her to speak instead of rushing to fill the silence. "I forgive you," she said simply, watching the words hit him like physical blows. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. You've done the work, Marcus. You've faced your demons, confronted your patterns, become someone new. I'm proud of you." His hand moved toward his back pocket, but she shook her head. "I'm proud of you," she repeated, "but I'm prouder of me. The woman who loved you unconditionally doesn't exist anymore. She grew into someone who learned to love herself more. Your growth is beautiful, but it's not my story anymore." "We could write a new story," he whispered, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I'm different now." Sarah smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand briefly. "That's exactly why I have to leave, because you needed to lose me to become this person, and I needed to lose you to become myself. Some love stories aren't about ending up together, they're about how we grow apart." She turned to the tabby cat, who watched them with wise golden eyes. "You should adopt her," Sarah said. "She needs someone who's learned how to love better." As she walked out of the shelter, her phone chimed with a new email. The subject line made her breath catch. ACPTD, Paris Photography Mentorship Program. 6 months in Paris, studying under some of the world's best street photographers. A new chapter, written entirely in her own hand. Behind her, she heard the shelter door open. Marcus's voice called out, "Sarah." She paused, but didn't turn. "Yes." "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. for showing me what real love looks like, even at the end." Sarah nodded, feeling the last weight lift from her shoulders. "Goodbye, Marcus," she said, and this time, the word felt like freedom. She stepped into the bright afternoon sun, her shadow stretching out before her like an arrow pointing toward tomorrow. Her phone buzzed with messages from Lisa and me. They were waiting at her favorite cafe to hear her decision. But they'd already know, she realized, just from seeing her face. After all, the greatest love story she'd ever lived wasn't about finding or keeping love at all. It was about becoming the kind of person who knows she deserves it. The cream-colored envelope arrived at Sarah's office on a Wednesday afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier who waited patiently for her signature. Her name was written in Marcus's distinctive handwriting, the slight leftward slant, the way he curved his S's. Inside, she found 15 pages of handwritten confession, each word clearly chosen with painstaking care. "I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness," the letter began. "I'm writing because you deserve the whole truth, even the ugly parts I've never shared with anyone else." Sarah's hands trembled as she read through his account of a childhood spent watching his father's infidelities destroy his mother piece by piece. He wrote about the night he found his mother crying in the kitchen at 3 a.m., clutching a lipstick-stained collar, about learning to smile at his father's friends at family dinners, about promising himself he'd never become that man, then watching himself become something worse, someone who hurt the one person who had loved him completely. Her phone buzzed with a text from me. "Did you know Marcus quit his job at Henderson and Mills?" Before she could respond, Lisa called. "Sarah, you won't believe who I just saw at the animal shelter." Marcus was cleaning kennels, looking like he'd been doing it for months. The pieces kept coming throughout the week. Her old photography mentor mentioned running into Marcus at a relationship counseling group. Their mutual friend James let slip that Marcus had turned down a prestigious partnership offer, choosing instead to join a smaller firm with strict ethical guidelines. Then came the USB drive, delivered to her studio during a photo shoot. It contained video testimonials, raw, unpolished conversations with people from every corner of Marcus's life. His therapist spoke candidly about his progress, maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging his dedicated work. His mother, tears streaming down her face, revealed how he'd finally opened up about his childhood trauma. Even his younger sister, who had always adored him, spoke honestly about watching him hit rock bottom and climb back up. The final video was from Amy. Sarah's finger hovered over the play button for a full minute before she found the courage to press it. "I owe you an apology," Amy began, her composed marketing executive facade cracking with genuine remorse. "Marcus told me you were practically separated, that it was just a matter of time. I chose to believe him because it was convenient. When he ended things after your confrontation, he told me the truth about how he'd lied to both of us, about how he created this whole narrative to justify his actions. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just thought you should know that he's not the same person who hurt us both." Sarah closed her laptop, walking to the window of her studio. The city stretched out below, a maze of possibilities and paths not taken. Her phone chimed with a new message from Marcus. "I know I've lost the right to ask anything of you, but if you're willing, I'd like to show you one more thing. The shelter is having an adoption event this Saturday. The cat that reminded me of Mochi is still waiting for a home." She stared at the message for a long time, watching the cursor blink like a heartbeat, wondering why the prospect of seeing him no longer felt like drowning. Sarah sat cross-legged on her red accent wall, surrounded by a maze of evidence. To her left lay Marcus's letter, dog-eared from repeated readings. To her right, her journal filled with pro-con lists that somehow never reached a conclusion. Her laptop played the testimonial videos on loop, their voices becoming a soundtrack to her sleepless nights. "You're torturing yourself," Lisa observed, watching her sister scrutinize a photo of Marcus at the animal shelter. In it, he sat on the floor, surrounded by kittens, looking more genuine than she'd seen him in years. The question isn't whether he's changed. The question is whether it matters. Sarah traced her finger over the image. What if I'm making a mistake? What if this is our story? The great redemption arc, the powerful comeback? Or what if it's not? Lisa countered, gentle but firm. What if your story is about becoming the person you were meant to be all along? The question followed Sarah to her evening walk, her feet carrying her unconsciously toward their old neighborhood. She found herself standing outside Cafe Una, where a young couple sat in the window seat she and Marcus had once claimed as their own. The girl laughed at something her partner said, trusting and open, unaware that love could become a weapon. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a video from Amy, different from the formal apology on the USB drive. In this one, Amy sat in what looked like a car, makeup smeared from crying. "I know I should leave you alone," Amy began, "but I need you to know something. When Marcus told me about you, he painted this picture of a relationship that was already over. I wanted to believe him because it made what we were doing okay. But yesterday, I found our old text messages, and I saw something I hadn't before. Even while he was with me, he never stopped talking about you. About how you leave post-it notes with silly jokes in his laptop bag. About how you remember everyone's coffee orders. About how you make him want to be better, even though he kept choosing to be worse." Sarah leaned against a lamppost, letting the cool metal ground her as Amy continued. "I'm not telling you this because I think you should take him back. I'm telling you this because whatever you decide, you should know that even at his worst, you were still his best. And maybe that's the problem." The video ended, leaving Sarah with the reflection of herself in the darkened screen. She looked different, stronger, certainly, but also sadder, wiser. The kind of woman who had learned that love wasn't just about feeling deeply, but about choosing wisely. At midnight, she found herself outside their old apartment building, key in hand. She'd never returned it. Through the lobby window, she could see the elevator where they'd shared their first kiss, the mailbox where they'd received their first joint Christmas cards, the spot where he'd knelt to tie her shoe one rainy morning, looking up at her with such tenderness that she'd almost proposed right there. Her phone lit up with another message from Marcus. "I know you're hurting. I know it's my fault. But I also know that the best parts of me existed because of you. I'm learning to make those parts exist because of me." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the lobby door, watching her breath fog the surface. The answer had been there all along, in the way she could acknowledge his growth without feeling responsible for it, in the way she could wish him well without wishing him back.